It's the most expensive arms race in history, but the real cost could be far greater. In 2024, nations poured a staggering $2.7 trillion into their militaries, a record high even as they drowned in pandemic debt, battled runaway inflation, and watched their infrastructure crumble. On today's episode of the Infographic Show, we're looking at why every country is preparing for a war that none of them can actually afford to fight. For decades, the General Dynamics Ordnance and Tactical Systems Factory in Scranton ran just one or two shifts. The 155mm artillery line turned out 10 to 14,000 shells a month, plenty to keep U.S. stockpiles full and allied nations supplied. Not anymore. Now the factory floor blazes with activity. Welders shower sparks across steel casings, while massive hydraulic presses stamp shell bodies out of 2,000-pound bars of steel with mechanical precision. The air thrums with the sound of artillery rounds rolling off the assembly line every 4 minutes. The factory is running at wartime pace. 3 shifts, 7 days a week, pushing out almost 40,000 shells monthly. The numbers tell the real story. Ukraine consumes more 155mm ammunition in 2 weeks than the U.S. produced in an entire year before 2022. The factory shells immediately replenish dwindling American stockpiles, drained by aid shipments to Kyiv. But it is a losing race. Every shell that rolls off the production line represents a small fortune to the average American family. But it's all part of the desperate and dizzying arithmetic of modern war. The scale of global military spending has finally reached levels that would make Cold War planners sweat. The United States alone spent $886 billion on defense in 2024, a figure so massive it exceeds the GDP of most nations. But breaking down that astronomical number reveals the true scope of America's military commitment. The Pentagon's base budget alone gobbles up hundreds of billions, but emergency supplementals tell the real story. Congress approved a staggering $30.6 billion emergency request for ammunition stockpiles, more money than most countries spend on their entire military. Another $113 billion went to foreign aid, much of it replacing American weapons shipped overseas. The result? America is funding 3 major fronts: Ukraine's fight against Russia, an escalating Middle Eastern war, and a military technology race with China. For the first time in American history, interest payments on the national debt, $640 billion annually, now virtually exceed defense spending. The Treasury Department's own analysts describe this as entering uncharted fiscal territory, where borrowing costs compete directly with military readiness for federal dollars. China's response has been equally dramatic, though shrouded in characteristic opacity. Beijing's official military budget for 2025 is $296 billion, representing a 7.2% annual increase that is sustained for over a decade. But Western intelligence estimates suggest a real figure approaches $450 billion when accounting for dual-use technologies, military-civil fusion programs, and off-budget nuclear modernization. Beijing now possesses the world's largest navy by hull count and has doubled its nuclear warhead stockpile since 2020. And it fields hypersonic weapons that U.S. defenses cannot intercept. Each Chinese military advance triggers billion-dollar American countermeasures, creating an action-reaction cycle that certain pundits have called the world's most expensive chess match. Europe's rearmament tells an even more dramatic story. Germany, which spent decades treating military modernization as an optional expense, eventually committed to doubling defense spending within 5 years to surpass NATO's 2% GDP target, upping the target to 3.5%. After Putin's invasion of Ukraine in 2022, the then-Chancellor Olaf Scholz announced a €100 billion special fund for military modernization, the largest defense investment in German history, while warning the parliament that we are living through a turning point in history. Today, Germany has surged to become the world's 4th largest military spender. Its defense budget is now the highest in Central and Western Europe since the 1990 reunification and the collapse of the Soviet Union. All of Europe is following suit, some like Poland leading the charge. Spooked by Russian aggression, the Poles almost immediately increased military spending to 4% of GDP, ordering almost 1,400 K2 Black Panther tanks from South Korea and 250 M1A2 Abrams from the United States. The total package amounts to $6 billion for a nation with a GDP smaller than Florida's. What is going on? Even traditionally neutral nations have abandoned decades of military restraint. Sweden, which maintained neutrality through 2 world wars, not only joined NATO, but increased defense spending by 40% in just 2 years. Finland followed suit, ending its careful balancing act between East and West to become NATO's 31st member. Nothing illustrates Europe's security transformation like Sweden's quiet quest to prepare for war. In 2018, the Swedish government mailed a 32-page pamphlet titled "If Crisis or War Comes" to all 4.8 million households. The booklet, updated for the first time since the Cold War, provides instructions on stockpiling food, finding shelter during air raids, and identifying disinformation campaigns. Most Swedes probably thought this kind of preparation was history. But neutrality isn't neutral when your neighbor threatens nuclear war. You choose a side. Sweden's military transformation has been swift and costly. Defense spending jumped from $6.2 billion in 2021 to $8.75 billion in 2024, with plans to reach $29 billion by 2035. The government reintroduced military conscription, expanded civil defense programs, and began construction of new underground command bunkers. Most symbolically, Sweden abandoned its policy of arms export restrictions, shipping AT-4 anti-tank weapons directly to Ukraine. Switzerland's response has been more subtle but equally significant. The Alpine nation, famous for armed neutrality and secret banking, quietly authorized $6.5 billion for F-35 fighter jets, despite fierce domestic opposition. Swiss military planners have begun modernizing the country's extensive network of alpine fortifications, bunkers and tunnels built during World War II that can shelter 114% of the population. More telling is what's happening in Switzerland's financial sector. Major banks have established economic warfare task forces to prepare for potential exclusion from international payment systems. Credit Suisse's collapse in 2023 taught Swiss authorities that financial neutrality offers no protection in an interconnected world where sanctions can cripple entire economies overnight. Meanwhile, in 2024, Japan poured $50.2 billion into defense, its largest military budget since World War II, and an 11% jump from the year before. But the nation is drowning in debt, with a debt-to-GDP ratio of 260%. A defense buildup against China is projected to drive spending up 65% over the next 5 years. Nearly a third of Japan's population is now over 65, and the debt service alone will swallow 40% of government revenue by 2030. This is today's debt trap reality. It's impossible for anyone in these types of situations to overlook the confounding influence of the COVID-19 pandemic. The global event not only killed millions, it financially crippled nations that are now racing to rearm. Global government debt spiked during the pandemic, creating the worst fiscal crisis since World War II. Countries that spent trillions keeping their economies alive are now spending additional trillions preparing to stave off existential threats abroad. The United States, despite its economic strength, runs a budget deficit of 6.2%, levels the Congressional Budget Office describes as unsustainable. The federal debt reached $33.7 trillion in 2023, growing by $1 trillion every 100 days. Yet defense spending continues climbing, driven by China's military expansion and indefinite security commitments to partners across the globe. Things are even worse in Europe. The continent's economy contracted by 6.1% during COVID-19, the worst recession since the 1930s. Energy costs exploded after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, with natural gas prices spiking by 400% and forcing governments to subsidize heating bills. Now these same cash-strapped nations must fund massive military modernization programs, partly out of peer pressure and partly due to a genuine fear of resurgent authoritarian revisionism. With a debt-to-GDP ratio of 144%, among the highest in the developed world, Italy should be cutting spending. Instead, it increased military expenditures in 2024 in a bid to get up to the 2% minimum threshold stipulated by NATO, committing to new fighter jets, naval vessels, and missile defense systems. Back in 2018, during President Trump's first term, he was already pressuring the Europeans to spend upwards of 4% of GDP on defense. After one fiery meeting with the American president, Italian Defense Minister Elisabetta Trenta burst out laughing at the president's demands. Spending 4% of GDP on the military cannot be done, she told the press then. It isn't even thinkable. It's already incredibly difficult to get to 2%, even though we have agreed to that. In today's jittery security climate, even Italy is scrambling to justify pushing military spending beyond 4% by 2035. One creative solution is building the world's longest suspension bridge between Sicily and the mainland, then reclassifying it as a national security expenditure and NATO strategic asset. Suddenly, a $16 billion construction project becomes a loophole, disguised as a landmark. We respect the hustle, but calling a bridge a missile shield? Well, that's a stretch, even for NATO. The United Kingdom is still reeling from Brexit's economic disruption and post-pandemic inflation, and also scrambling to build bridges in the quest for military modernization, but not in the literal sense. The Brits recently locked themselves into a 50-year AUKUS nuclear submarine deal with Australia worth up to £20 billion for Britain in exports over the next 25 years. The price is about 5% of Britain's entire annual government spending, financed entirely through borrowing. Meanwhile, Australia is going all in. It's spending 368 billion Australian dollars over 3 decades for nuclear submarines, including billions funneling back to U.S. industry. Former Prime Minister Paul Keating called it the worst deal in all history, warning that it puts all of our defense eggs in one basket. A retired senator and submariner piled on, it won't deliver capability fast enough to deter, let alone fight the war it's supposedly for. The brutal economics of modern warfare make traditional cost-benefit analysis obsolete. Consider Ukraine. Western nations have provided well over $200 billion in military and economic aid since February 2022, and that's more than the annual GDP of 140 countries spent in just 3 years of conflict. Modern weapon systems carry price tags that would fund entire government departments. A single U.S. hypersonic missile costs over $14 million. That glitzy B-21 Raider stealth bomber program is projected to cost $203 billion for 100 planes. That is $2 billion per bomber, enough to buy each one a seat on the Fortune 500. But there is good news. Adjusted for inflation, Aviation Week now says the first 21 Raiders might cost only $668 million apiece. That's right, military budgeting has entered its off-brand Costco era. Buy in bulk, save billions. Meanwhile, the F-35 still runs $80 to $109 million per jet. And that's before you add lifetime maintenance. That price tag currently stands at $1.58 trillion and will only increase. It's proof that stealth doesn't come cheap, especially when it needs software updates more often than your iPhone. A war over in Taiwan could trigger a $10 trillion global economic shock overnight. Half of the world's semiconductor supply, the chips that power every iPhone, every car computer, every advanced weapon system, comes from Taiwan, and nearly all of it is made within 100 miles of the potential invasion zone. Reuters sketched the nightmare in blunt detail. In the mildest scenario, China encircles Taiwan with a naval quarantine, cuts underwater cables, and dares the world to intervene. In the worst-case scenario, it launches the largest amphibious invasion in history while raining missiles on U.S. bases in Japan and Guam. Either way, war games agree. Even if the U.S. Navy sinks ships and holds the line, it bleeds badly doing it. The Brookings Institution warns that China's military gains have made the outcome inherently unknowable. But one thing is certain, everyone loses, especially Taiwan. Despite these terrifying projections, Western countries continue arming for the type of globally interconnected conflict that could destroy their very way of life. The Pentagon war game concludes the same way it has for 3 years running. America would win the military conflict, but lose the economic peace, spending a decade recovering from a war that lasted 6 months. Putin's 2022 invasion of Ukraine certainly didn't reassure anyone. Instead, Russian aggression jump-started the biggest military buildup since the 1930s. The ripple has spread worldwide. China's rise under Xi, aircraft carriers, hypersonics, destroyers, sent neighbors scrambling. India pumped $75 billion into defense. The Philippines, historically inward-looking, is throwing $35 billion at military modernization. Japan is sharpening its self-defense force into a real joint military with bite and is exploring a partnership with South Korea, once wartime enemies, to co-develop missile defense systems to counter China and North Korea. Political scientists call it the security dilemma. One nation rearms, rivals react, and costs spiral. China builds carriers, the US builds subs, Russia rattles nukes, Europe rearms. Everyone sees defense but feels offense. It's the world's most expensive game of chicken. Everyone is spending billions, but no one dares to blink. For NATO's smaller states, the 2% GDP pledge makes the most sense, yet for such small economies it can feel like a straitjacket. Estonia spends nearly 3% of its GDP on defense, despite having less economic firepower than Tulsa, Oklahoma. Latvia's 5% of GDP defense bill now tops its education, health, and infrastructure budgets combined. If proposals in Washington prevail, U.S. defense spending could explode to $1.7 trillion annually by 2034, a peacetime figure nearly double the Cold War peak. Without a plan to pay for it, that increase would more than double the federal fiscal gap, turning a fixable budget challenge into a full-blown economic time bomb. and nowhere is the cost of modern warfare clearer than in Ukraine. On March 15, 2023, a visiting American intelligence officer watched as Ukrainian artillery crews torch $50,000 in ammo every minute. Each 155mm shell costs $8,000. HIMARS rockets come in at $168,000 a shot. Guided Excalibur rounds are somewhere between $60,000 and $112,000 each. And that is just the surface. Russia's Zircon hypersonic missiles run over $5 million per unit. China's DF-17 glide vehicle probably cost billions to develop. The US has spent billions trying to catch up with no fielded system yet. Even cheaper systems add up fast. Turkey's $5 million Bayraktar TB2 drones proved deadly, but jamming them costs billions. The US Army's new AI-integrated air defense system is priced at $1.1 billion each, meaning a Patriot battalion would probably cost $4 to $5 billion, and likely obsolete in 5 years. Cyber war flips the equation. Low-cost offense, sky-high defense. Estonia spends $50 million a year protecting its networks. The US pours nearly $10 billion into Cyber Command, with billion-dollar contracts to Microsoft and Google for infrastructure that didn't even exist a decade ago. The real bottleneck is manufacturing. Ukraine has been given over 8,000 Javelin anti-tank systems, but the US makes 2,400 annually. Semiconductor shortages are now delaying weapons production, and China controls a vast percentage of the rare earth minerals needed for advanced military tech, creating a choke point money can't quickly fix. History backs the warning. The Soviets spent 15 billion rubles in Afghanistan and collapsed. Britain won World War II but limped out broke. At the height of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the United States was spending upwards of $12 billion a month. Forecasts of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan have U.S. costs topping $1 trillion annually, or 6.7% of GDP, not counting the shock of a global supply chain collapse. The security dilemma that once fueled superpower arms races now threatens the economic foundations of civilization itself. Every defensive measure appears offensive to rivals. Every weapon system demands countermeasures. Every alliance obligation triggers cascading spending that no treasury can sustain indefinitely. As military budgets soar while nations struggle under record debt burdens, the fundamental questions remain unanswered. Are they preparing for victory or mutual destruction? In their desperate race to prevent their own annihilation, have the world's powers instead guaranteed it? If tensions keep rising, the next big conflict is likely to erupt in the Pacific. Watch how US will respond if China invades Taiwan to see one of the most likely flashpoints, or click on this video instead.